how the fossil record poses a problem for Darwinian evolution. It actually poses two big problems.
Right. Well, we've been talking about a doubt that Darwin had about the adequacy of his own theory, its ability to explain all the evidence. And his doubt concerned a major event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion, in which the first major groups of complex animals arose very abruptly in the fossil record. And this posed two problems, two mysteries that were really unresolved by Darwinian theory. The first I like to call the mystery of the missing fossils, because these animals appear very abruptly in the Cambrian layers, but as you go back into the lower pre-Cambrian strata, you don't find any evidence of the ancestral forms of those animals, the simpler forms that you would expect to find according to Darwin's theory, because Darwin expected that the first complex forms of life would have emerged very gradually as a result of the accumulation of numerous slight variations or changes generation to generation. You just don't see the accumulation of those changes in the lower strata.
So that was a problem.
That was a big problem. But there's an even more fundamental problem, and one that we've grown to appreciate in much more depth in the 20th century and 21st century, and that's essentially an engineering problem. How would the evolutionary process have built these complex forms of animal life, especially since they arose so abruptly in such a narrow window of geologic time? And that's, in my book, I look at both of those two mysteries, but the second mystery is more fundamental, and it's grown very much more acute because of things that we've discovered in modern biology during the second half of the 20th century, since the 1950s. And in particular, things that we've discovered about the information-bearing properties of living organisms and the information-bearing properties of the amazing molecule known as DNA.
Yeah. When Crick and Watson came out with this discovery, what did they show us?
Well, Watson and Crick made the extraordinary discovery in 1953 that is, world-renowned. It was they were able to elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule, and they showed that the DNA molecule had this famed double helical structure with 4 chemicals running along the inside of that helix. And as most of us learn in biology class at some point, the DNA is the molecule that contains hereditary information, and it has a helical structure. Along the outside there is this winding ladder, double helix ladder made of sugar and phosphate. On the inside of the molecule there are these 4 chemicals called bases or nucleotide bases. And in 1957, 4 years after the structure was discerned, Francis Crick put forward I think what was one of the most important hypotheses in the history of science. It's called the sequence hypothesis. And what Crick proposed was that these 4 chemicals that chemists represent with the letters A, T, G, and C are actually functioning like alphabetic letters in a written text, or like zeros and ones in a section of computer code. That is to say, it's not their chemical shape or structure that matters. What matters is the arrangement of those chemicals, such that they are able to convey instructions for building all the important proteins and protein machines that keep cells alive. So what you have on the DNA molecule is literally digital code that provides instructions for building the crucial parts of cells that allow all life to exist.
When you go down that spine, how much information is there?
Well, in the human genome, there's about 3 billion nucleotides. And even in a single one-celled organism, there is enough information to build a minimally complex one-celled organism. Requires about 400 or 500 proteins. And that's going to compute to several hundred thousand what are called base pairs, or individual nucleotide letters in that genetic message.
That all have to be arranged precisely.
They have to be arranged precisely so that the instruction set will direct the construction of these proteins, these various kinds of proteins that are needed to keep cells alive. And proteins are essentially the toolbox of the cell. That some of them process information, some of them build structural parts, little miniature machines. We're discovering inside cells there are literally little tiny machines. There's a form of nanotechnology, sliding clamps and rotary engines and robotic walking proteins. And then some proteins catalyze reactions. These are the enzymes that we hear about. So proteins do all the jobs that keep cells alive, and animals alive, but they can only be built if the instruction set is right, and that instruction set is stored on DNA.
Even Bill Gates, when he looked at this, what did he say?
Well, Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever been able to create. And many biologists have made similar observations. Famed biotech pioneer Leroy Hood has said very, very directly that DNA contains digital code.
All right, explain how DNA relates to the Cambrian explosion and what we're talking about.
Well, right. I used to ask my students a question, and if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they'd say, well, code or instructions or software or information, and all of those are correct answers. And it turns out that the same thing is true in life. If you want to build a new form of life from a simpler pre-existing form of life, you need new information, or rather, to put it more precisely, the evolutionary process would need to generate new information, new code. And that raises a big question. How does it do that? How would it do that? How could it do that? And one of the reasons that's such a big problem, a big question, is that the mechanism, the evolutionary mechanism, the driving force of the evolutionary process is thought to be natural selection acting on random genetic mutation, random changes in the arrangements of A's, C's, G's, and T's. The digital characters in the DNA molecule. Mm-hmm. But what we know from experience of computer code, for example, is that if you start making random changes to digital characters in a message-bearing sequence, you're going to degrade the information that's present in that sequence long before you're ever going to generate something fundamentally new and useful. I mean, just ask yourself a question if you're a computer programmer. If you've got a functioning computer program and you start randomly changing zeros and ones, are you going to generate a new program or operating system, or are you're going to introduce glitches and bugs into the program you already have?
Yeah, all our techies in the room are saying, keep the bugs away.
Yeah, keep the bugs away. And so there's something fundamentally disquieting from the standpoint of information science about the idea that random changes in a functional section of code or text could generate something fundamentally new. And so that's been a kind of general concern that scientists have had about the creative power of the Darwinian mechanism. Can the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection and random mutation really generate new functional code? Because to build a new animal, you need new code. You need new DNA with digital information stored in those molecules.
Go back to this thing now of chance. I think Murray Eden at Worcester Institute called a conference in the 1960s, and he was a mathematician, and he called evolutionary biologists, and he had people that were working on the atomic bomb. He had all kinds of scientists there, and he had a question that was bugging him. What was it?
Well, Murray Eden was a computer scientist at MIT, and there was a picnic in 1965 where the computer scientists and the physicists and the mathematicians and the engineers were talking with their biology colleagues over lunch. And all these scientists with mathematical training were expressing skepticism about the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism. They didn't believe that it could generate new genetic information on the scale that was required to explain things like the Cambrian explosion. And their main reason for thinking that was they realized that random changes in any formal language system will inevitably degrade meaning. And that is because there's a lot more ways to go wrong than there are to go right. If anyone's played Scrabble and you have a pile of letters, you know that if you just reach in and start picking the letters out at random, you're overwhelmingly more likely to get gibberish than you are to get a word. And that's actually because people have worked out the math on this. The ratio of functional words of any given length to the ratio of sequences of characters that give you gibberish is really minuscule. It's in the case of a 12-letter word, I think the ratio is 1 over 100 trillion. One word for every 100 trillion arrangements of characters that give you nothing but gibberish. So if you start with a word, or start with a section of functional genetic text or a section of computer code, and you start randomly changing it, you're overwhelmingly more likely to end up with gibberish, because most of the sequences are gibberish. And that's the problem that the engineers were concerned about at Wistar. And so this is just not a good way to think about how genetic information originated. This mechanism simply is unlikely to produce anything good in the time we have available.
Or as Murray Eden says, it's improbable. It probably couldn't happen.
It's improbable on a cosmic scale. Yeah.